Welcome to The Next Word. I'm your host, Christine Warnke. February is Black History Month, and it is fitting to have a special guest today to talk about the lost African American history right here in Washington, D.C. I believe that we should unite those who love to write about history with those who love to read and hear about it. And my guest, Mr. Tim Stevens, has co-authored the book, Section 27 in Freedman's Village in Arlington National Cemetery, bringing this amazing story to light and to all of us. Tim, thank you so much for being here.
Oh, Chris, thank you for the...
traveling down from Philadelphia.
Oh, thank you so much for the invitation. Looking forward to the discussion.
I'm so intrigued with this whole thing. First of all, I'm intrigued the fact that why did you write this book with your co-author, Ric Murphy?
Yeah.
I mean, what prompted you to write and research, which was a tremendous amount of time?
It was. I had lived in the district for almost 20 years and then moved away. But when I came back, I lived in Arlington, and the cemetery was about a quarter of a mile from where I lived. So I would take a walk, enter from the side of the cemetery beside the Iwo Jima Memorial, and just go for my morning walk. And if you take a right as you go in that part of the cemetery, you're immediately in a very different piece of Arlington National Cemetery. You're in the Section 27, where the largest number of non-military are buried, and they are actually in a part of what was at one time called the Lower Cemetery, but they are the self-liberated enslaved that established the cemetery as a cemetery rather than as a slave plantation. So I just stumbled onto this artifact through my morning walk, and that just led me to dig and dig with my co-author Ric Murphy into the rest of the history of Arlington and why it's profoundly shaped by the lives of African Americans.
So, and Tim, Ric Murphy, I know, is your co-author.
Yeah.
How did you connect?
He and I had been business colleagues for a number of years. He and I had shared friendship and other activities we've been involved in, like I say, mostly starting with business. And by that time, Ric had written a number of biographies of his own family and had become a successful writer on African American history, him being a son of a white family in Massachusetts and a African American family in North Carolina. In fact, the coming together of those people over the 400 years of American history is at the heart of what he writes about. And I encourage people to go and look for more of his books as well.
The National Arlington Cemetery, again, is fascinating to me because it's gone through so many changes and hands. And can you sort of take us all back and
sure.
tell us how this all, how it became the National Arlington Cemetery? And
I think that's the heart of the book. Something that looks so permanent, something that's so well known. 4 million people come through Arlington National Cemetery as tourists or as visitors or as people burying their heroes and our heroes in the hallowed ground on Arlington every year. So it's a very well-known piece of ground. Yet it has been transformed over and over again during the time it's been a cemetery, and then even before that, when it was, as I talked about, a slave plantation. And the part of the story that we try and bring out in our book is how profoundly it is the lives of African Americans and them coming to Washington, D.C. during the early years of the Civil War that both established the place and then for many years afterwards was the place where they both lived. They transformed the landscape, and ultimately, as the late part of the 19th century and beginning part of the 20th century, were pushed off that land, and their story isn't well understood because what looks so permanent now and is visited and has so many other artifacts there has not obscured it so much as they've made those permanent rows of graves, has filled out the over 600 acres there. So in the early part of the 1800s, the land became the property of George Washington Parke Custis, a descendant of Martha Custis and her husband George Washington. Then for the rest of his life, until he died in 1857, it was run as a slave plantation. And George Washington Parke Custis was probably the largest owner of enslaved in the District of Columbia, remembering that until 1846, Arlington was part of the District of Columbia until it was retroceded to Virginia. Not many years after he died, the property was being managed by his son-in-law, Robert E. Lee, well-known colonel in the Union Army and general in the Confederate Army. He left to go and lead the Confederate Army, at which point, at the secession of the state of Virginia from the Union Army moved across the 14th Street Bridge and occupied the property. It became an essential part of the defense of Washington, D.C. Many, many people moved from the eastern shore of Virginia and from Maryland to their freedom behind the Union lines. And those African Americans also lived all across Arlington, supporting the Union Army that was in the forts that circled the area and providing them housing and cooking and laundry services, as well as all of the other logistics that a large army needs. Often those that labor hasn't been fully documented, but that's essentially how the landscape at Arlington changed from being a slave plantation into a essential part of the defense of Washington, D.C., and why we now have a cemetery, because as the city of Washington grew, the capacity to bury the dead in Washington was overwhelmed. And so the first few people that were buried were people transported out of Washington into the area we now call Arlington National Cemetery.
But it was they were military?
No, those would be civilians. At that point, there was no military cemeteries like we understand them, except on the battlefields. I mean, if you look at Antietam and the other places where the Civil War was being fought, those became military cemeteries. But this system we have today, where you have designated spaces, had not, that wasn't the practice. In fact, the practice for most wealthy Union soldiers was to actually send them back home. There wasn't a military cemetery, and that wasn't thought of as the practice you wanted. You wanted to have your lost sons, mostly sons, back with you in your own hometown. Not true always for poor soldiers or for soldiers that couldn't be identified, of course.
So the cemetery itself, when did the Defense Department took over? What year?
Well, you could say they took over as soon as Robert E. Lee and the state of Virginia seceded, because that property, for national security purposes, became the defense of the city of Washington. formerly the Quartermaster General of the Union Army, Meigs,
Right.
took control over the entire land in May of 1864. At that point, there were numerous people already buried in the lower cemetery, the area we call Section 27 now. In addition to that, Meigs, decided this was a very appropriate place to bury Union soldiers who had died during the war around Washington, D.C., and he deliberately buried people around the house, Arlington House. And at that point, with this dire need for additional burial space, we began to see the filling out of the area as a cemetery. A segregated cemetery, though. The African Americans who worked there, who had fought there by that time, and as 1864 went on, more and more troops joined the ranks of the U.S. colored troops. They were always buried in the lower cemetery, the Section 20, what we called Section 27. Right. Even as a number of officers and significant burials, as we see today, were being done up and around the house. That said, the full cemetery that we see today, with 600 acres of thousands upon 600 acres, yes, thousands upon thousands, somewhere above 600,000 people are buried there now, was in the years after the Civil War variously a village. The Freedmen's village was there. This was a village established in 1863 to house many of the people who supported the Union Army with the logistics helps we talked about, and was a farm as well. Many of the people, 200 acres out of the original acreage, was devoted to a farm that was managed by tenants, majority of whom were African Americans who had lived in the Freedmen's Bureau after the Civil War. Those 200 acres, actually, part of that is now where the Pentagon is. So right. the cemetery, the actual cemetery land is larger than the portion we see today. That ultimately was, by 1900, stripped from that group of African Americans who lived there after the Civil War. And as the years went on, other parts of the cemetery have been added, taken away as well. We know Fort Myer is on the most on the area just north of the house, west of the house, excuse me. But it's a piece of property that looks permanent, but has been transformed numerous times. And numerous times it's been the lives of African Americans who have been at the center of those transformations. Fascinating.
And also children. There are children that are buried in Section 27.
A number of
children, right? Without their names, but
sometimes with their names.
It seems it would say child or.
Yes. I mean, the difference between the specification that we see on the graves of many of the soldiers that are there, that might include their rank, their battalion, their birth and death dates, compared to the simplicity with some of the graves that are in Section 27, which might just say unknown or child, right. With no date. So it's a very heterogeneous part of the cemetery. I encourage people to go and see it for themselves, and how how to peel back the layers of who those people were.
Right. We're going to take a short break. This is fascinating, and we're going to come back. When we come back, we'll talk about the Freedman Village, which is truly a lost history from my standpoint. and we'll be back. You're watching The Next Word. We're going to take a short break. Thank you.
I surrender.
All right, pal.
Hey, Dad. Do we have a gun?
What's that?
Do we have a gun?
Why do you ask that, kiddo?
Can I play with it?
No, absolutely not. It's not a toy. You know that. Anyway, I need it to protect you, your sister, and Mom.
But what about the 8 kids who get shot every day by mistake?
Where'd you hear that?
Where do you keep it?
It's hidden.
I bet it's on the top shelf of the closet, under your sweatshirts. Is it loaded? Remember when I found my Christmas gift? You always told me to be curious.
No, that's not what I meant.
And when it's just me and Mom, I could use the gun to protect her.
No, Justin, I promise. I'm always here for you.
But Dad, you're not always here.
Sunshine through today with seasonal temperatures. We should reach our normal high of about 82 degrees by this afternoon. Clear skies tonight with a low near 70.
Welcome back. I'm your host, Christine Warnke of The Next Word. And today I have a special guest, Mr. Tim Stevens, co-author of a book entitled Section 27 and the Freedman Village in the Arlington National Cemetery. And Tim, thank you again for being here.
Thank you.
It's fascinating. I've been reading this book, and it's a lost history. And I wish everyone could read this book, because how important it is to the African American community in our part of Washington.
Yeah.
Is now, of course, Arlington National Cemetery.
And it's not a story that's finished, in that just in the last couple of months, the cemetery changed again. The Confederate monument was removed by act of Congress, with the Secretary of Defense, as he had with many of the other bases around the area, specifically removing history that had been imposed on that cemetery by different forces, different political forces in the early part of the 20th century that had brought a reconciliation between wide opinions about why the Civil War had been fought, but hadn't necessarily included all of the stories of the African Americans that we document in the book. So with we will continue to see different voices describe what it is we want from our national cemeteries, and our most hallowed ground has continued to be something that describes the variety of people who we are as Americans.
Oh yeah, and some of the famous African Americans that came, and descendants of the original enslaved people in Freedman's Village.
Yes, yes.
It's something that needs to further be explored and brought out to the public. And
yeah, Freedman's Village was a key component of the activities that the federal government undertook to bring change to the group of, most cases, self-liberated enslaved that came from Eastern Maryland and Eastern Virginia, and used the sanctuary of the Union lines to get their freedom, as they had earlier in the war, when General Butler allowed African Americans to come into his army down in Eastern Virginia, and refused to give them back to the generals and colonels of the Confederate Army, saying they were contraband of war. That if they are property, which many of the Confederates assumed African Americans could be, he would not return their property, because as such he would be helping them fight a war that was illegitimate against the Union.
The beginning of Freedman Village, the title, the name Freedman, comes from free, from enslaved.
The Freedmen's Bureau was a welfare and a work and a military capacity that was designed to help educate and to keep healthy the the enslaved that had come to the Union side of the war, and to bring them understandings, if you like, of the language and the customs and all of the other systems that were available to freed people. So the Bureau would also be a payment system and the other things. This was a deliberate attempt to find a way to manage the labor as much as anything of the self-liberated enslaved.
Now, part of their wages, though, part of those wages went back to contributing to the operations of the village. Is that correct?
Well, the village came out of the activities of the Freedmen's Bureau.
Okay.
It was set up as a model village. Space for some 200 families was there. The Bureau itself changed management and changed purpose as we went from different times in the war to post-war activities. But there would have been certainly a lot of management of things like wages that a system like the Bureau would have been involved in.
And it sort of served too as a sort of an apprenticeship program or a training center to learn about being a blacksmith, right? Correct. Other trades.
Yeah, some of those skills were available there, but many of those skills would have been things that the self-liberated and enslaved brought with them, which is why they were so valuable in the early times of the fortification of Washington that went on in Arlington Heights. The base labor that African Americans provided was enormously important, and something many of the Union soldiers themselves would not do. They believed they were there to fight. They weren't there to move the land and build the forts and those things. So that labor was enormously valuable and often skilled, just as it had been deployed by the enslaved on behalf of their masters when they were before they came to Washington.
Now, Washington still being a swamp, as they say.
Right, right.
There were a lot of health issues.
There surely were, yes.
And I know there was a number of rates of high smallpox and maybe typhoid and other. And a number of the people didn't survive, correct?
Correct. I mean, and many of those are people buried
in Section 27?
In Section 27. The very public health emergency that was Washington, D.C. in the summer of 1863 led to bodies being shipped across the Potomac to Arlington and to other places outside of the city, because the city's cemeteries were already full by that point.
Wow.
And to the extent that this was a edge community, that edge of Arlington, not central to the prosecution of the war, that was a convenient place to bury them as well.
It's fascinating. So the village had a hospital, it had a school.
They did. Those things have been documented by better than we have done in the book. Those were things that we saw in other parts where the Union Army would have gone, both in New Orleans and particularly in the Sea Islands of South Carolina, where large numbers of African Americans came to support the Union cause. And this was just another location where a large population of African Americans, D.C. quickly became a majority African American city during the Civil War, because it was such an attractive place to escape slavery.
Oh, absolutely. But there were many other facilities on the site within the Freedman Village, which later the whole village was somewhat removed. I mean, it was totally removed, correct?
Yeah.
When did that happen?
Into the 1880s and 1890s, there was still a farm and tenant farm system that had built off of the Freedmen's Bureau had been disbanded by the middle of the 1870s, but the housing and the area that was farmed in the southeastern part of Arlington remained into the 1880s and 1890s before the federal government, the Department of the Army specifically, declared its purpose was to stop that use of the land and removed that from those tenant farmers, and with the purpose of taking the land for the expansion of the cemetery as more and more soldiers were buried across that land.
Which now is almost full to capacity. I mean,
almost, yes.
So a number of famous African Americans came out of the Freedman village and were descendants of the Custis family, and one of them being John Syphax.
Maria Carter Syphax
Yes.
Was given her freedom by George Washington Parke Custis in the 1820s. She and her 10 children were given their freedom, and she was granted 17 acres. This was an acknowledgement that many of those children were also his. He, the white enslaver, and she, an African American enslaved. And that 17 acres remained in the Syphax family for a long time after the Civil War. But again, as the federal government decided the purpose of that land was to become a cemetery, full-fledged, and a military base, they ultimately lost that land. The family has documented that, and there are a number of other places to go and learn more deeply that story. But that was one of the few people to fully be manumitted by the Custis family during their entire enslavement of people on that property.
And John Syphax, he later became a Republican member of the House of Delegates for Virginia.
Yes, and there are schools in Southeast DC with the name Syphax on them.
Oh, there are.
There are a number of descendants of the Syphax family who became prominent educators and leaders in the African American community in the greater DC area.
Now, has the book made it into some of these schools? And I would think there'd be a wonderful
That's a great question.
welcome.
That's a great question.
To have your book, because it's a history, again, as I said, it's a lost history.
Thank you. Yeah. No, there are large aspects of it that, if not lost, they're buried.
They're buried
under other layers of other histories, for sure. Not as far as I know.
Okay, we have changed that.
You know, we still, we're still going to discuss so many aspects of what is history and whose history, and this is part of the ongoing discussion of what is America.
So Tim, thank you.
Thanks for the opportunity.
No, thank you, Tim. It's been great. It's been great. Thank you. I just want to thank again my guest, Tim Stevens, for being on this show. It's just great to learn more about Tim's work. If you want to, please visit timothystevens.online. Thank you all to my viewers. If you want to see more of The Next Word, please visit mmctv.org. Have a wonderful evening, and thank you.